The 13th fire is a powerful and continuing legacy of the young men who parachuted into Mann Gulch, but it is also the legacy of the other men whose lives it touched and drastically affected. As I research and tell the story year after year, it becomes obvious to me that other writers may have glossed over the Mann Gulch fire boss, District Ranger Bob Jansen, and the role that he played in the incident. So I wrote my own version of the story, which I call the 13th Fire. At the age of 26, just married and freshly graduated from the School of Forestry at the University of Montana, Bob went to work for the U.S. Forest Service in the fall of 1941. Bob's first assignment was as an assistant ranger on the Helena National Forest in the Canyon Ferry Ranger District. In those days, the Canyon Ferry Ranger District covered nearly 1/3 acres of mostly timber and grazing land in the Big Belt Mountains east of the Missouri River. The Ranger District had its offices located near where the Canyon Ferry Dam now sits, about 15 miles northeast of Helena. The weather pattern that summer of 1949 started out looking like a copy of the previous year's weather, cool and wet. During May and June, there were frequent rain showers, many cloudy days, and the temperature stayed cool. By mid-July, the rains had stopped completely. For the 2 weeks leading up to the fire, the temperature in Helena and the surrounding area climbed into the 90s every single day. A large storm system swept into western Montana early on August 4th. By 4 p.m., the system had rolled up over the Continental Divide west of Helena and over the city. Towering, thick black clouds replaced the sun and began to dump their load of rain mixed with small hail over Helena. Within minutes, the storm moved on and rumbled out across the Helena Valley and over the Big Belt Mountains. Lightning strike after lightning strike came with the sometimes heavy rain. Moments after the storm cell moved off to the east, the local Forest Service telephones began to ring and reports of smoke started pouring into the dispatchers. The Helena Forest men chased a total of 25 smokes that evening. Friday, August 5th, 1949. Bob awoke early on the morning of August 5th and walked over to the district office. At about 8:15, he put in a radio call to the Meriwether Guard Station on the Missouri River, located about a mile upstream from the mouth of Mann Gulch. He instructed his Meriwether Guard, Jim Harrison, to start his fire patrol at 11 a.m. This fire patrol consisted of hiking up to the top of a high ridge north of Meriwether and looking into the deep side canyons off the river for possible smokes. Jansen told Jim to report back to the district office on the radio at 3:30 that afternoon. Jim Harrison was 20 years old in August of 1949. Jim's family was from Missoula, and he was a student at the university there. This was his first season as the Meriwether Fire Guard. Ironically, Jim had been a smoke jumper in Missoula during the 1948 season, but his parents, concerned about the dangers of smoke jumping, had convinced him to find another, more safe summer job with the Forest Service. Following the radio conversation with Harrison, Bob grabbed his second-in-command, Henry Hersey, and they drove the 15 miles into the Helena airport. When they arrived, they boarded a single-engine airplane and were flown east to the Big Belts to recon the two fires already burning on the district, the Bull Run and Cave Gulch fires. Both were burning 10 to 20 miles southeast of Mann Gulch. The aircraft circled each fire while Bob made notes on the estimate of the men and equipment they'd need to fight these blazes. When they were satisfied, Jansen and Hersey continued on their aerial patrol, flying over the Big Belts looking for additional smokes. At about 11:25 a.m., their patrol took them directly over the ridge line just to the north of Jim Harrison's patrol point. Their pilot made a second pass a mile to the north, but they never spotted the lightning strike that would become the Mann Gulch fire. With their patrol complete, Jansen and Hersey flew back over the Cave Gulch and Bull Run fires for a final look, and then flew back to the Helena field and landed. But while the Forest Service men never saw the fire on the ridge line, Harvey Jensen sure enough spotted it. Jensen operated the commercial boat tours through the gates of the mountains on the Missouri, and he was always on the lookout for birds or critters to point out to his passengers. At around 10 a.m., as he was bringing the day's first boatload of tourists down the river, Jensen spotted a thin wisp of smoke coming up from the ridge line between Meriwether and Mann Gulch. As soon as he landed the boat at Meriwether and made sure his passengers were safely ashore, Jensen hustled up the trail to Harrison's cabin and told Jim about the smoke. When Jim received the information, he immediately tried to contact the Canyon Ferry District on his radio to report the fire. But Harrison couldn't raise anyone on his radio, so he strapped on his smoke chaser pack and headed up out of the Meriwether Canyon to scout out the fire. After Hersey and Jansen landed at the airport at 12:25 p.m., Bob found a phone and called his boss, Helena Forest Supervisor Dunk Moyer, to report his aerial observations on the Cave Gulch and Bull Run fires. But during this phone conversation, he learned that Don Barker, the lookout on Colorado Mountain, located some 9 miles southwest of Helena, had called in a smoke report. His report indicated there was a smoke column coming up from Mann Gulch. Barker reported the smoke at 12:18 p.m. When he received the news, Jansen grabbed Hersey and ran back to the hangar. They helped refuel the plane and took off again, heading straight for Mann Gulch. Meantime, overhearing the lookout's report of the smoke, Jansen's radio dispatcher back at the Canyon Ferry District office started to fill in the fire report for him, as he did for all district fires. Fire name, Mann Gulch. Ranger's fire number, 13. The 13th of 57 fires the men of the Helena Forest would tackle that hot, dry summer. Jansen and Hersey arrived over the fire at 12:55 p.m. They estimated the fire had already burned 6 to 8 acres of mixed juniper and small ponderosa pine along the top of the ridge, and observed the smoke was trailing to the northeast right up the ridge line. The pair flew directly back to the airport and landed at 1:15 p.m. and drove uptown to the supervisor's office to discuss the fire situation with Supervisor Moyer. In their discussions, they decided to use the bulk of whatever local firefighting forces they could muster to man the growing York and Cave Gulch fires. Both fires potentially threatened nearby homes and ranches. Because Jansen and Hersey were more familiar with the country around Mann Gulch, it was decided that Hersey and Bob would take a crew of 19 men and establish a fire camp at the mouth of Mann Gulch. As district ranger, Jansen was to be the fire boss. And because they all agreed that most pickup firefighters would be no match for the rough terrain along the Missouri River, they decided to ask for 25 smoke jumpers from the Missoula smokejumper base. Dunk Moyer telephoned the jump base at 1:30 p.m. When the Helena Forest Supervisor reached the dispatch center in Missoula, he was advised that while there was no shortage of smoke jumpers, the jump base was running a little short of aircraft to deliver them. Apparently the same storm system that swept over the Helena Forest the previous afternoon and ignited its fires had also raked Idaho and western Montana, setting off several other blazes. At the time available for immediate dispatch, one plane could only hold 2 jumpers, but the other plane, a twin-engine C-47, could deliver 16 smoke jumpers and their gear. Moyer requested the 16 jumpers. Once the order for the jumpers had been placed, Jansen and Hersey spent the next few hours trying to organize their 19 pickup firefighters. They outfitted them with tools, had the men hauled 20 miles north to the boat launch on the Missouri, and then boated 6 miles down the river. Meanwhile, at 2:30 p.m., the C-47 with its load of 16 smoke jumpers lifted off from Missoula. The temperature in Helena pegged at 97 degrees. On board the eastbound plane on its 40-minute flight to the Helena Forest were the pilot, Ken Huber, co-pilot, Frank Small, Forest Service photographer Elmer Bloom, spotter Earl Cooley, assistant spotter Jack Nash, and the 16 jumpers. As the spotter on this mission, Earl Cooley was the most experienced smoke jumper and spotter the Forest Service had to offer. Cooley had participated in the very first smoke jumping experiments began 10 years earlier. By 1949, he had been jumping and spotting for other jumpers for 10 years. Robert Wagner Wag Dodge was the foreman assigned to this crew and this mission. Dodge was 33 years old, and he'd been working for the Forest Service for 16 years. He'd been a smoke jumper for 8 of those 16 years. William Bill Hellman was Dodge's second in command and a squad leader. Hellman had been smoke jumping since the 1946 season. He was 24 years old. Walter Rumsey was 21. The 49 season was Walt's second season with the Forest Service, his first as a smoke jumper. Mann Gulch was his first fire jump. Robert W. Sallee was just 17 years old in 1949, but he had already worked 2 summers with the Forest Service while still in high school. In 1949, he applied for the smoke jumpers and was accepted. Mann Gulch was also his first fire jump. In August of 1949, Robert J. Bennett was just 22. This was Bob's rookie season as a smoke jumper, but he had worked for the Forest Service the 2 previous summers. 1949 was Eldon E. Dietert's 4th season with the Forest Service, but his first season with the smoke jumper program. August 5th was Eldon's birthday, and he interrupted his birthday dinner with his family to take this jumping assignment on the Helena Forest. Philip R. McVeigh was working his second season as a smoke jumper in 1949. He had 3 seasons of work with the Forest Service under his belt. McVeigh was 22 years old. 21-year-old Martin L. Sherman was a rookie smoke jumper also in 1949, with only 3 fire jumps, including the jump into Mann Gulch. Joseph B. Sylvia was 24 years old. Although he was a second-year jumper, Mann Gulch was his first actual fire jump. Silas R. Thompson, age 21, was working his second season as a smoke jumper. Thompson had made 3 fire jumps in 1948, but Mann Gulch was his first fire jump of the 49 season. Also working his second smoke jumping season, Stanley J. Reba was 25 years old in 1949. Newton R. Thompson, no relation to fellow smoke jumper Silas Thompson, was 23, and this was his second season with the Forest Service, but his first season smoke jumping. Henry J. Thole Jr. was the only son of a retired Forest Service Ranger. Henry was just 19 years old. He had worked 1 other season with the Forest Service. Mann Gulch was his first and only fire jump. Leonard L. Piper was working his first season with the Forest Service, so he too was a rookie jumper. Mann Gulch was also his first and only fire jump. Piper was 23 years old. David R. Navon, at 28, was one of the oldest of the rookie smoke jumpers. Like many of the men on this mission, it was his first season smoke jumping. The 16th jumper on this crew was Merle Stratton, but the flight from Missoula to Helena was a rough one with considerable turbulence. Inside the C-47, the air was stifling and made worse by the crew's heavy jumpsuits. With the heat and the aircraft bucking up and down, Stratton became airsick during the flight, threw up into his helmet, and elected not to jump. At 3:10 p.m., the C-47 arrived over the fire. Spotter Cooley and Wag Dodge moved to the floor of the open rear door of the airplane. They estimated the fire had already grown to nearly 50 to 60 acres. They observed the fire was continuing to burn along the ridge line that divided Mann Gulch from Meriwether Canyon to the south, and it still seemed to be following the prevailing winds and moving in a northeasterly direction. But they noticed that it was also backing down towards the river and creeping off the ridge down into Mann Gulch. At somewhere between 3:15 and 3:20 p.m., Dodge said he and Cooley agreed on the jump spot for the men and equipment. They chose a spot on the north side of Mann Gulch at the head of the drainage. Dodge said he and Cooley chose this particular jump spot because they agreed it was the safest. It had few trees to complicate the jump, was 500 feet lower than the fire on the ridge line, and was nearly 1/2 mile north of the blaze. At 3:35 p.m., after dropping some colored streamers to determine how wind speed and direction would affect the drift of the men and cargo chutes, the C-47 headed down the gulch, and the first group of 4 men jumped from the plane. Following tradition, Foreman Dodge was the first one out. The pilot took the C-47 around in a large, lazy circle, and the next group of 4 men jumped into the head of the gulch. He made another turn, headed down the gulch, and 4 more smoke jumpers stepped from the plane. Another turn, and the last group of 3 men stepped out into space. Cooley and Nash began to ready the cargo packs, but perhaps as an inkling of things to come, the pilot informed the men that the air in Mann Gulch had become too turbulent to allow him to drop to treetop level to deliver the supply packs. They were told he'd have to maintain the same altitude from which he had just dropped the smoke jumpers, about 1,200 feet off the draw bottom. And so on the next pass, Cooley and Nash kicked out the first of several cargo packs. Everything was routine until they came to the pack which coincidentally contained the jumper's only radio. When this cargo pack was pushed out the door, the static line snapped in 2 before the parachute was deployed. This cargo pack free fell 1,200 vertical feet and smashed into the ground downslope about 400 yards from the jump spot on the north side of the drainage bottom. Their sole radio and most of the other supplies in this pack were destroyed. Because back at the Missoula smoke jumper base there was a growing concern about the weight of cargo packs, to save weight, no backup radio was included with the equipment. Now the men were without a communication link to the outside world. The cargo drop was completed by 4:08 p.m. The C-47 made another 2 passes over Mann Gulch, and at 4:12, Cooley and Nash spotted the orange streamers the crew had laid out on the ground, forming a double L, indicating everyone had landed safely. The C-47 banked west and headed home for Missoula.